If you were to read through the Old Testament, you are not going to have to read for very long before you recognize a pattern. From the very beginning, one of the biggest and most deeply rooted problems that God's people dealt with was idols, an obsession with idols. They seemingly just could not get rid of them, not completely. Not that they had them all the time, forever, the whole time, but throughout their history, they kept popping up. They kept appearing. They kept getting themselves in a position where they had them in some way. There are many, many references to idols in the Old Testament. The word idol or idols is found, and these are just approximate because it was a little confusing. Some of the words are interchangeable in the Hebrew, so there might be some overlap. But in general, the word idol or idols is found about 137 times in the Old Testament. Then there's the word God or gods with a little g, 187 times. Image or images, 50 times. Then there's the word teraphim, which is another word that's used for gods, household gods, images, something like that, 38 times. Then there's graven images or graven image, 34 times. Molten image or molten images, 20 times. So clearly, I didn't add all those up, but a few hundred times these things are brought up. Clearly, it was a major problem. And half of those times that the word idol or idols occurs are found in Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. And that's because the prophets were having to strongly denounce idols and rebuke the people for having the idols. It wasn't just, back in the beginning when the law was given, you shall not make images for yourselves and bow down to idols. But even, hundreds of years later, the prophets kept having to bring it up and rebuke them and say, put away the idols, the false gods, the foreign gods, or there will be consequences. And those references to idols unequivocally are connected to a few different things. Either a negative command, like in Exodus 20, verses 4 and 5, you shall not have them. It's connected to stupidity and foolishness and worthlessness, like in 1 Chronicles 16:26 and Psalm 31, verse 6, and some others. It's connected to sin and an abomination, Deuteronomy 7, verse 25. God's anger and jealousy, Deuteronomy 32:21, that Ron just read a second ago. They provoked me to jealousy with their idols, their foolish idols. And it's connected to destruction. One of those references. In Hosea chapter 8, verse 4, Hosea says, with their silver and gold they made idols for their own destruction. They made idols for their own destruction. Destruction is the result of idols. But this leads us to a natural question, a very good question. What is an idol? What is it? It may be one of those words that I talk about often that as soon as you hear the word, you already know, or you think you know. Because you may think of it in the biblical sense, of the historical, the ancient sense of it's a thing that people pretend is God, more or less. They treat it as God or as some sort of mediary between themselves and God. And they bow down to it, like the 90-foot or whatever statue that Nebuchadnezzar fashioned. And they were supposed to bow down to the image of him. Or the golden calf that Aaron made with the people's jewelry that they were worshiping, God said. But that's not all that an idol is. And an idol, sometimes we use that word. More commonly today, that word is used for maybe somebody that is a great role model. Somebody that somebody looks up to. It's certainly not a word that I would say it's an unfortunate synonym for a role model or somebody, a famous person. They're an idol. Even we have a show called American Idol. But simply speaking, an idol is simply an object of extreme devotion. An object of extreme devotion. And William Mounce, who is a Greek scholar and somewhat of a Hebrew as well, I guess, but especially Greek, he said, idolatry is not limited to the worship of false images, that is the literal bowing down and worshiping of false images, but it is placing anything or anyone before God as the object of allegiance and devotion. Idolatry is the practice of placing anything or anyone before God, or even alongside God, I would say, as an object of allegiance or devotion, a thing that I'm devoted to. I pledge my allegiance to this thing, maybe not in a literal, direct sense, but just in a practical sense. My life pattern shows that I'm devoted to this thing more than God. In other words, something that we're devoted to or dedicated to, loyal to, more than or instead of God is what an idol is. Anything that we place in God's place, basically. The hard truth is that every one of us has at least one idol in our lives. Right now, I guarantee you, everyone in this room has an idol. I have idols in my life. I know I do. I know I shouldn't. And I generally know what they are. And once we come to realize that, we'll be in a better position to identify or locate these idols and get rid of them, eliminate them. Can't eliminate them until we know what they are. We have to identify them, what the idols are in my life, because it's going to be different than, or at least most likely will be different than the idol in your life. We have to identify first we have to understand what an idol is. Just because I don't have a golden calf in my living room that I and my family bow down to regularly doesn't mean I'm not guilty of idolatry. In fact, as we saw either last Wednesday or the Wednesday before that, Paul says that covetousness is idolatry. Even coveting things, at least, will lead to idolatry because it's putting something, being more devoted to or loyal to or dedicated to something than you are to God. Think again about that statement in Hosea chapter 8, verse 4. They made idols for their own destruction. You think they did that on purpose? You think that's what they were intending to do? Some Israelites said, you know what, I'm kind of in the mood to do something that's going to lead to my destruction. Anybody have any ideas? And then somebody else said, oh, I got one. Why don't we make idols? Perfect. We'll make idols so that we'll be destroyed. No, that's not how it went. They weren't seeking to do something to bring about their destruction. They weren't trying to make idols for their own destruction. They were making idols for their own satisfaction in one way or another. Nevertheless, as Hosea said, their destruction is what it brought. It always brings destruction, having idols. And I would say in the most narrowed down and summarized fashion, we might categorize all the idols that there can be into three categories. Three different types of idols that we're going to look at for the next few minutes. The first kind of idol is what we might call, and these are not official terms, I made them up, but we might call them technical idols. They're idols in the technical sense. What is a technical idol? A technical idol, what I mean by that is, it is any person, place, or thing to which we assign attributes or actions that belong exclusively to God. Any person, place, or thing that we treat as having the same traits or attributes or actions that only God can have. Like blessing, like salvation, like any kind of blessing, I guess, however many kinds of blessings we might say there are. Anything that we attribute traits or actions that are God's traits or attributes only. Some examples: dead people. People who have died, whether recently or a long time ago. If we treat them as though they have some sort of ability to do anything for us that only God can do for us, like Mary or Peter or Paul or some other godly saint who has gone on before. Cities, maybe. Jerusalem. Somebody might treat Jerusalem, it's the holy city, it's been called. If I go there, I will receive some sort of divine blessing just by being there. Or Bethlehem, where Jesus was born. Or Nazareth, where he was raised. Some idea that those places inherently have some sort of built-in blessing. I've turned it into an idol because only God can give divine blessings. Or so-called holy objects. Objects, things that supposedly give me some sort of blessing. Rosary or crucifixes or statues or representations of Jesus or whatever else. Those are, in the most technical sense of the term, idols, because we are assigning to them traits and abilities and actions that belong exclusively to God. And therefore, we're making them like God, because we are believing and claiming that they are able to do something that only God can do. Then there are what we might call practical idols. Practical idols. What is a practical idol? A practical idol is anything that is placed over or before God, or that gets between a person and God. Anything in my life. Now, the previous kind of idol, I would say, may be more rare today as a rule, but it more closely resembles the idols of old. This kind of idol, though, may be the most common today. It is an idol, something, anything that I put above or before God in my life, or that I let get between me and God, or maybe that I put between me and God, in a sense. Like that golden calf was technically in between the people and God, because they were trying to worship Jehovah through that calf in their ignorance. What are some examples of practical idols? Well, an example of technical idols was dead persons. Well, an example of some practical idols is living persons. For instance, my spouse. Did you know your spouse can be an idol? And you don't have to bow down at their feet and worship them and call them God for them to be an idol. If I put them above God in my life, my spouse is an idol. If I care more about what my spouse wants than what God wants, my spouse is my new God. Parents, same thing. Children, siblings, other family members, friends, my boss maybe. If I care more about what my boss wants than what my God wants, my boss has become my God. And therefore, my boss is an idol. Extracurricular activities can be idols. Sports, various clubs, etc. If I am more devoted to those things than I am to the Lord's church, those things have become an idol. If I am more dedicated to those things than I am the Lord and His church, those things have become idols. Hobbies, fishing and boating and television and whatever else. It's the same concept. If I am more devoted and more generally associated and loyal to those things than I am God, if I would choose those things over worshiping God, for instance, then I've made an idol out of that thing because it's better than God. And every time I choose that over God, the worship of God, I'm declaring that to everyone. Everybody. I'm telling everybody that I'm not here because I'm worshiping my idol. Occupations can sometimes become idols. Sometimes it's not a choice, I understand that. But there are times where it may be a choice. And I choose to put work above worship and God in general. In those instances, these are practical idols. They are idols that are not even, tangible things per se in the sense of a statue, but they are things or people that I've put where God ought to be. I'm not attributing God's attributes to them, like in the other case, but I'm putting them where God should be. Or I'm putting God, maybe, where they should be. And ultimately that brings the same thing. Practical idols. There is a third, more conceptual perhaps, but it is still a real thing in my opinion, and that is what we might call principle idols. A principle idol is any worldly principle that a person is willing to adhere to over biblical ones, or what is right. It is a worldly principle or moral that I am willing to choose over what is right. It's a principle. It's a way of thinking and living, a way of behaving. For instance, choosing myself over others. That's not a scriptural principle, not even close. I'm supposed to put others above myself, and especially God above myself. But if I choose in my daily life and my general way of life to put myself above others, I've made an idol because I'm choosing something that comes from the world over something that has come from God. Ignoring the misfortunes of others, maybe. Not caring, not being concerned, not being considerate or compassionate, which leads to another, turning a blind eye to those in need. I know what I ought to do, but I'd rather do this thing that's not that. Then I've tipped the scale. Here's what should be done. This is better for me. This is what I'd rather do. Disregarding the concept of reaching others with the gospel. No concern. I have no desire, no concern for trying to reach others. I'm just going to go about my life, and that's that. Even though God, the Lord Himself, has commanded that we make it public, that we do try to reach others with the gospel, that we do share our faith, so to speak, in that way. There's another way we can do this, and that is whenever we choose the morals, certain personal preferences over, I'm willing to sacrifice or disregard what I know is right just to appease some sort of personal preference or opinion. Like people that I might support, politicians that I might support, political candidates that I might support, and the principles that they might stand for. And if they are not aligned with what the Bible stands for, what God stands for, am I willing to sacrifice and choose them over God? And don't take it for granted, and don't ever make the mistake of thinking that your vote doesn't have a spiritual element to it, because it does. It's not just political. Just because it's in a booth where nobody can see, God sees. And if I choose a candidate who stands for things opposed to God and God's will, then I'm choosing the things that are opposed to God's will. Can't separate the two. It just can't be done. And by the way, not voting is also an option. Somebody says, well, then can't ever vote. Okay, then don't vote. It's your prerogative. And it's totally, I respect it completely. I do not subscribe to the notion that a non-vote is a vote. Doesn't even make sense. It's illogical. But what I do need to understand is that if I vote and support someone who wants to implement things that are abomination to God, I'm voting for the abomination. I'm supporting the abomination and the sin and putting my stamp of approval on that. And we should be very careful. We've created an idol in that case because I care so much about whatever this is, this political party or this political candidate, that I'm willing to ignore what God has said is right and wrong. So these could be called principal idols. No wonder Paul was so adamant and direct when he said simply, flee from idolatry. Just as simple as that. Flee from idolatry in all its forms. Whether it's in the sense of covetousness, like he talked about, or in the sense of maybe actually having, even to the extreme sense of having a statue in your house. Even if it's Jesus or supposed to be Jesus, it's not. It either is Jesus or it's not Jesus, and it's not Jesus, and therefore it's an idol. It is something that is being treated as God that is not God. Flee from that. Flee from idolatry. John said, little children, keep yourselves from idols. Whether they are literal, actual idols, whether they are the practical kind of idols, the people in my life or things in my life, or whether they're principles that I'm placing above God's will. Keep yourselves from them. Don't have them. And Paul to the Thessalonians commended those brethren there and he said, you turned from idols to serve the living and true God. That is what we ought to do. That is what we need to do. Turn from idols, serve God. Whatever our idols are. We need to find them. We need to, it doesn't mean we have to get them out of our lives, because if my spouse is my idol, I don't need to get my spouse out of my life. I just need to get my spouse out of God's seat. And whatever else it might be, get it out of God's seat. At least, get it out of God's seat. At the very least. No matter what kind of idol we have, the end result is the same as it was for the people of Israel. Destruction. When we make an idol, whether we intend to or not, we are making it to our own destruction. In truth, the single most common idol in the world from the beginning of time has been the same. And that is me. The self. I, myself, just the self is the single most common idol that people struggle with, because it's so easy for me to put myself in God's seat. And anytime we make ourselves an idol, every time and any time we seek our own will rather than God's. Okay, God says that, I'd rather do this. Or, God, I see where it says that, but that's not what that means. Can you explain why that's not what it means? No, I just don't think it means that. I don't want it to mean that, and so I'm going to pretend like it doesn't mean that, because I'd rather do what I want to do. I've made myself an idol. And every time we do that, we've made an idol to our own destruction. Whether it's myself or something else, it is the only thing that it can bring about is destruction. So what about us? Like I already said, I hate to speak for you, but I'm pretty confident that there is something in everyone in this room's life that could be classified as one of these kinds of idols. The key is to find it, to accept that that's what it is, acknowledge it, be honest with yourself. That's what a sincere and honest, open heart is. I am willing to admit to myself that this is the way that it is and that I need it to be another way. I shouldn't be like this. This should not be in the position that it is in my life, and I need to change that. That's the goal. What are my idols? Going to make sure, just like some of those heroes of the Old Testament did, like Josiah and Hezekiah, obliterating all the idols in the land, the altars on which those idols were worshipped, getting rid of them completely and totally. The good news is you have time to do that. You can do that, and God will accept it when you do, but not until you do it. And we need to take advantage of the time that we have to make sure, examine ourselves, to make sure I'm not living a life that's full of idols. What are they? Where are they? And how can I get them in the trash can?